Now let's look at the documenting the API. For the REST endpoints, the documentation is very much important because we need to provide the API documentation to the consumers. Either they can be internal or the externals. So how are you going to provide the documentation? The documentation can be provided in any manner, but the consumers needs to understand. Now, how are you going to provide the documentation as per the common specification? We have Swagger documentation and other set of documents as well. So for that, first we need to add a dependency into the Maven file. So let's open the Maven file and we need to add Spring Doc Open API. So let's go here. Let's add the dependency. So the dependency and adding the artifact ID, and it has imported, and I'm taking at this point, at the time of recording, the version is 2.0.2. Let's format it and save it and update the Maven repository. So Maven repository has been updated and built successfully as well. Do I need to do any other thing? No. That's all we need to do. Once we add the dependency, Spring Boot will take care of the rest. So let's start the server. Server has been started. So by default, the documentation can be accessed at localhost Swagger UI HTML. So let's go there, and this is the localhost Swagger UI index.html. By default, all the controls has been parsed and nicely showing the details about that. Now let's try for API 1. So as part of it, when I try it out, we got welcome user. And what about the parsing the user? So here it's showing the request parameter as well. So when I'm saying it, it is giving by default that was provided at the request parameter annotation, and it has been showing here. Also when I execute it, I'm getting the response as well. And what about the post method? So in case of the post, it is showing the schema, because we are taking the request body as an object, and which is the user detail has user ID, username, first name and last name. So all details has been shown here. When we click on the schema, it is showing that what are the values that it takes. So user ID is taking an integer and all of them are strings. So here we can try it out. So I can give the values, and when I send execute, it will be executed and the response will be given. And here the schemas. So in case of the post, here we have seen a schema. So the schema will be provided here at the separate section, or we can see that schema at the API itself. Now if we see it, this documentation is good enough, but still we need to know why this API is being used. For example, this is a welcome control. What is the difference between the get user here and the post user? Or what is this /v1 does and this /v1 user does? So that kind of little more information also will be useful. So in case of the post, we're returning two different statuses. One is the created status, another one is the bad request status. But by default, it is coming as a 200, which is not correct. It's not the valid response code. So we need to update the documentation to provide the right set of response codes. So we need to update the documentation to provide a right or the correct response code. So how are you going to send it? We need to say that API responses or API response. So as part of the API response, I'm saying that if the response code we're expecting a string, so in this case accept created is a 201. So we need to pass 201 and we need to give the description what exactly it does. Here in this case, user is create. If response code is 400, in this case bad request, the bad request takes the response code as 400. So in this case we are going to say description as invalid payload. Once we save it, let's wait for the server to reload it. Server has been reloaded, and refresh the page. When I refresh the page, now you can see that the response code has been updated 201 as user created and 400 as an invalid payload. Now we have updated the responses, and what about the API itself? So we can update the API as well using operation. So as part of the operation, we need to provide summary. Summary would be shown at the API level and the description would provide in the detail. So here create user, and as part of the description, user would be created using response body object. Just I'm giving some values and save it and wait for server to be reloaded. Reload the page. Now if we see it, the summary has been displayed as create user, and when we open it, the description has been shown here. Now, what about the request body? So we can add the documentation for the request body also. So let's add the request body annotation, but be careful here. The request body annotation is at the Spring framework and at the documentation. So be careful with that one. And here I'm using documentation one, and I'm providing description as user JSON or user object. So when I save it, wait for server to be reloaded. Server has been reloaded. And when you refresh the documentation, the description has been provided at request body. So let's implement this similar at other places also. So in this case, I'm updating the same for the put mapping and updating the operation as update user. User would be updated using the request body, and the request body is the same. So here I'm saying existing user object and the same 201, and the bad request is the same. Now let's write the documentation for the delete mapping. So let's take the operation. So as part of the operation, summary is delete user, and user will be deleted using user ID, and the response is 201, which is in this case user is deleted, and here is user is updated. So response has been taken care and API is taken care, but the path variable that needs to be taken care. So the path variable needs to be provided as a parameters. So we need to provide the parameter, and the parameter name is in this case user ID, and description user ID. Sorry, this is a description. So in the description we are saying user ID as a user ID. Let's implement for the patch. So in case of the patch, we are saying summary as patching user, and user object would be updated with, I'm saying different name, non-null values, and the status is accepted. So let's copy the API response, and then we have a parameter and the request body. Let's copy the request body. I'm copying the request body. Request body is patched user object, and I need to have the user ID as well. So user ID, copy from the parameter, reformat. So in case of the error, we'll look at that one later. For now, let's save all of them and wait for server to be reloaded. Server has been reloaded. So let's refresh the page. And if you see it, the post has create object, patching user, delete user, all the summaries has been updated. And when we open it, the description is updated. The description is updated and the parameter has exactly the same. So now let's look at the put mapping. In case of the put mapping, description is updated, request body also been updated. Let's look at the delete mapping. So as part of the delete user, we're having the delete, and the status has been updated 201 as a deleted, and in case of the put, status has been updated 201 as taken as user updated. Now let's update the parameter also for put mapping. So the put mapping takes the user ID and patch also takes the user ID. Let's save all of them, wait for server to be reloaded. Server has been reloaded and verify it. Okay, so in case of the put, user ID has updated as user ID, and in case of the delete also, user ID has been updated, description has been updated, and in case of the patch also, user ID has been updated. So we have updated the API level, each API, what is the summary and the description and the parameters and the response statuses as well. Now let's update the remaining as well. So let me update. Now I have updated all the APIs. So in this case of the API one, we just mentioned the API and error simulation. So what are the errors that are simulated, and request parameter, what exactly is this? Everything is been updated. But what about the welcome controller? How are you going to update at the controller level? So for update the controller level, we need to use a different tag, which is a tag. So here we need to say it, what is the name? So in this case, welcome API, and let's say the description as simple welcome API creation and simulations. So I updated it. So I updated the tag at the controller level. Let's wait for the server to be reloaded. Server is been reloaded. Let's refresh it. The tag parameters has been considered and will be shown. In case of the welcome control, it is showing welcome API, and the description also shown here, which is updated at the rate tag. So let's look at the I18 controller as well. Let's update the same I18 and API. I18 translations, and let's update the endpoint as well. Message. So I have updated the controller summary as message translation and description as username local is captured and used for the translation. So let's save it and wait for the server to be reloaded. Server has been reloaded and refresh the page. So here the API, I18 API has come and message translation and description also updated. Now we need to update the request parameter and the locale. So let's update the parameter. In this case, user, and the description, username or name. As part of the I18 API documentation, the summary has been updated and the parameter, which is a request parameter, has been updated, but the locale cannot be captured at the documentation. We check the official documentation. As part of the documentation, principal locale has to be servlet, request and responses are ignored. So the locale information will not be shown at API documentation. And when we run it, it might fail as well. Let's run it, because as part of it, we need to send the header also. The header has not passed, so that's the reason it's failed at the API documentation. But if we send the request from the postman, it's still success. Only from the documentation tryout has failed. API documentation does not capture locale. So far we have learned how to add the documentation for our APIs. We know how to add at the resource level. At the API level, we will be adding @annotation operation. And for the parameters, we will be using parameter for the request parameters and path variables as well. And in case of the response status, we are using API responses. And at the control level, we are using @tag. And what about the global level? What I mean is, there is no information about the source of the API creation or the API implementation, who implemented, what is the licensing information. Such information will be kept at the global level using the OpenAPI definition. Let's add that one as well. I'm adding the information at the Springboard because that is at the global level. So I'm adding over here, and here we will be providing info. As part of the information, we need to use the info tag, and as part of the information, we need to give the title. So this is, I'm saying, learning RESTful web services, and the description, implementing REST API using Springboard 3.x, and we'll be saying the contact, whom it needs to be contact. So here we need to add the contact information. So let's add the contact. As part of the contact, we need to give the name, email. So in this case, I'm giving my name and email. I'm giving the sample email, test@test.com. So here I'm using version 0.0.1 snapshot, or we can copy from pom.xml. So let's add to the next line, so for the better. So the title, description, contact, version, license. Okay, so as part of the information, title, description, contact, and as part of the contact we have provided, as part of the license, this one, and info is that, and it is here. So as part of the license, so let's create license. So here we need to give the name. I'm saying MIT, and we have the MIT license URL. You can provide the URL as well. For now, I'm providing as google.com. It's for the demonstration purpose only. So once I save it, the server will be reloaded, and the same information will be provided at Swagger documentation, at the OpenAPI documentation, as a header. So if we see it, as part of it here, learning has been shown, and the version that I have given 001 snapshot, it is showing it here, and the description and the contact information and the license information. So if you see the license information, it is showing as google.com. So ideally, as I mentioned, the URL needs to be given properly. And in case of the contact, the link is provided as a mail to, so your email client will be opened with email ID. So that concludes how to add the documentation for our RESTful API using the Spring Doc OpenAPI dependency.